Drums of War, Chapter 53, Part 1. On the lowest traffic planet in the Republic. For the most part, when Terrans altered planets, they simply got them habitable and at near terrestrial gravity. Sure, there were some odd ones altered as massive art projects, or some that were ill-fated improvements or iterations on Earth biomes or previous projects such as Australia 3. But Terrans generally liked to preserve as many unique features as possible when making a planet suitable for Terran settlement. Repose was not in any of those categories. It had been maliciously designed from its very core to the furthest reaches of its stratosphere for one purpose: restfulness. Its tectonics never shifted in any way that could be considered violent. Its volcanic activity was harnessed and vented in such a way as to collect the energy. Its hills were gently rolling waves of grass. Its mountains were merely gentle rolling waves of trees capped with an easy dusting of snow. Its rivers snaked lazily towards placid seas with universally picturesque beaches. Even the weather was highly controlled so that it never stormed. The wind only ever breezed, and the rain only fell in sorrowful, hazy mists. Here was a cemetery reserved for servicemen of the Republic of Terra and her aligned planets. This was repose. Hundreds of thousands of white marble crosses stood eternal vigil on either side of a river here. A swirling spiral of grey granite tombstones held mute memories for those below. Atop a hill in a crown of sorrow there, gilded graven Molnir reliefs glittered in the sun on a bluff overlooking water, lapping at white sands below there. A crescent moon of black marble rectangular tombs sheltered in the shadow of the copse of aged oaks in the valley there. And again, across the planet, the fallen had their rest. The living trod here, lightly and quietly, as if they might by accident disturb the eternal rest of those interred beside those that they had come to visit. But they did come. The living came to lay flowers at headstones, to pour liquor out on graves, to leave challenge coins or credit chits on tombs, or words from the heart. Yes, the living came to visit. However, they also came to lay men and women to rest. Final rest. A group had come to do just that on that day, led by the matron Mary George in all her regal glory. She had vowed that she would not set foot on repose until her Robbie's remains had been recovered at the outbreak of hostility, and that vow had consequences. It had kept her from burying Roger when he too fell in battle. 5. She was the mother of 5 sons, all of whom she loved dearly, and the evil chances of a hostile universe had robbed her of nearly half her greatest choice in life. She leaned against her husband, Eric, Major General Eric George, for comfort more than support, as they carefully wound their way through one of the Catholic cemeteries. She had done her best to respect the vestiges of Ignition culture. She had researched Cajun and Creole pre-colonization traditions and customs, since those were the sources of Ignitia's ethnicities. But God only knew how many details were lost across the centuries. A slow, soft dirge played, or rather was played, by a brass band that marched behind her and her stalwart husband. Music to soothe the heart of those cut down in battle before the fullness of their years. Behind them, her sons were carried by 2 of her sons. Johnny was the lead pallbearer for Roger, and Linus did the same for Robbie. Linus had always looked up to Robbie, and here was one last thing Johnny could do for little Rog. Poor Pete couldn't bear the weight of either casket after his injuries, so he brought up the rear bearing 3 banners, the colors of the Lost Boys, of the 2nd Star Rapid Response Group, and of the Honor Guard. He had insisted that he carry the triangular bundles of starch cloth himself, and could manage the cane without help. The dress backs of the R&I made her boys look too much like hardened men for her liking. They did that today, in any case. The only boy there who looked like a boy at all was the child Gideon. Her grandson, by adoption, walked with nervous steps at her left hand with wide, wondering eyes. She was proud of little Pete for adopting him, but Gideon would be needing a mother, and all 3 of her surviving sons were still bachelors. Behind a younger son came all those who wished to pay their respects and could attend, from those who knew her fallen sons and were their friends, to those who believed they owed the fallen for one act or another in their brief lives, to those who had admired them as heroes from afar. The memorial service had been held, and all who had wished to had their time to say their piece. It had done Mary's heart good to hear how many lives her boys had changed, how many dark paths were altered towards the light, how many acts of constancy and courage had inspired others as they served the Republic with honor and dignity. Many of those who had said their piece marched along behind the funeral procession to say their final farewells. Mary George had long since run out of tears to shed, yet she could hold her chin up in the knowledge that she raised her sons well. She did not need to insist with her husband in honoring her own Irish roots for the Celtic crosses that made up the headstones. He had always been more than happy to adopt her family traditions. 2 open graves yawned in the grass before the stark white marble crosses, graven only with names, ranks, and the dates of birth and death of her boys. Mary knew that their mere presence on repose said more than any engraved poetic farewell or description ever could. They were servicemen, one a lost boy, of the RNI, and a member of the Honor Guard to boot, and the other a commander of the 2nd Star Rapid Response Group Republican naval vessel who fell in service to their republic, each for their own reasons and because they had chosen to volunteer, just as their grandfather had done, just as their father had done, and just as their mother had done before retiring to raise her sons. Even when she did SAR work in the Corps, she knew it might demand of her the very life she cherished, and the services of the RNI and the Navy her husband and sons chose were more perilous still. But she also had pride that the George family did the work that needed to be done. Every serviceman knew the price, herself included. The caskets were laid on the gimbals that would be used to lower them beneath the earth in eternal repose, and the pallbearers each took up bolt-action rifles. The band fell silent, and the buglers stepped forward while the train of mourners caught up and gathered into an anticipatory crowd. Eric patted Mary's hand with one of his white-gloved fingers, and she allowed him to slide his arm around her elbow to take up position over the little guard of honor made up of pallbearers. 2 teams of 8 for a total of 16 guns. "Down!" Major General Eric George bellowed, and the little formation snapped to attention. "Present! Up!" he said, and the men lifted their rifles by the butts of their stocks and held them at a 45-degree angle to form a tunnel leading to the caskets awaiting their descent below the turf. "Sir, the Major General Eric George said, then turned towards the crowd and saluted. Those who had seen such things knew that this was their signal to step forward and pay their respects. The guard of honor's path led to Robbie's casket first, as he had fallen before his older brother, and those who knew him, those who had met him, and those who had admired him filed past the statuesque general, the mother who grieved beyond tears, the young boy who did not understand what he had witnessed, and beneath the shadows of the rifles, they laid flowers upon his casket. They laid challenge coins and medals. They laid credit jets and whiskey flasks. And most of all, they laid a final farewell upon a varnished cherry wood concealing his shattered remains. Last of all came Pete, who laid the folded banners of the lost boys and the honor guard atop the bounty laid there by those who regretted that the man that they had given them to could never enjoy them. He leaned on his cane and held the salute. "Guard, forward!" the generals cried, and the little guard of honor turned to face him, their rifles held by the butts of their stocks and leaned against their shoulders once more. "Right, pace!" he ordered, and the little guard of honor shifted their feet, twisted, and had suddenly turned to their right. "Ready, arm!" The men shouldered their rifles, the bayonets pointed skyward and glinting in the sunshine. "Take aim!" White-gloved fingers found triggers. "Fire!" 16 cracks rang out in the silence, and the sound of 16 gloved hands racking back the bolts and ejecting shining brass casings tolled like funeral bells. "Take aim!" Once again, the white-gloved fingers found triggers. "Fire!" The cracked guns rolled over the gathered crowd. Someone let out a sob. "Take aim!" The men once more did as bidden. "Fire!" The rifles reported, and the gentle hum of the electronic motor was raw in the somber quiet, even as the buglers played taps to send the fallen trooper of many victories and high honors cut down too soon to his final rest. The general walked up and down the line of immobile R&I troopers in their glittering patterns of night sky of dress blacks and policed the brass from the salute. He paused when he reached each of his 2 older living sons to give them a comforting pat on the shoulder. Mary could see Linus close his eyes against tears, while Johnny's face was like a graven stone. Eric strode up to her and held out a small silk bag of spent brass casings and saluted her. She took them and resisted the urge to embrace him. She knew that if she did, she would not be able to bring herself to let go of him again. The bugles fell silent, and the graves stood mute. Mary George's black lace veil fluttered in the breeze. "Come out, face!" Major General Eric George called, and the men dropped their rifles to cup their socks by their butts and rest their warm barrels against their shoulders as they spun in place. "Forward, march!" the general ordered, as he kept time a few steps ahead of them until he called, "Guard! Halt! Guard! Forward!" The honor guard faced Roger's casket with stern silence. "Turn up!" Major General Eric George bellowed once more, and the little formation snapped to attention. "Present! Arm!" he said, and the men turned to form 2 lines facing each other while they lifted their rifles by the butts of their stocks and held them at a 45-degree angle to form a tunnel leading to Roger's casket, awaiting its time to make its descent below the turf. "Stand, guard!" Major General Eric George said, then turned towards the crowd and saluted. Those who had seen such things knew that this was their signal to step forward and pay their respects. Once more, the people filed beneath the tips of the bayonets, glinting in the sun amid the shadows cast by the unmoving brothers in arms, to the fallen as they paid their respects. There were repeated faces, but unlike his little brother, Roger had been a Navy man, and thus more men in nearly reflective dress whites came to leave a ceremonial bolt on his casket, pieces of their still-living ships to accompany a fallen voidsman, in addition to the other grave goods offered to servicemen. Mary found a warm pair of hands envelop her shaking fingers, and looked down to see Gideon's too grave face, looking up at her with concern. She patted the boy's head and watched her son's many friends, brothers and sisters in arms, and admirers say their final farewells. Pete, even now, was the rear guard, always at the tail end, always chasing the 4 greatest heroes Pete ever looked up to. That count had been crudely cut in half by the evil chances of a hostile galaxy. But little Pete had courage anyway. Pete laid the folded flag of the 2nd Star Rapid Response Group over the collected offerings and bid his older brother one last goodbye. "Guard! Forward!" Major General Eric George hoarsely shouted, and the little guard of honor turned to face him, their rifles held by the butts of their stocks and leaned against their shoulders once more. "Right face!" he ordered, and the little guard of honor shifted their feet, twisted, and had suddenly turned to their right, while Mary could see the weight of grief between his shoulders again. "Ready, arm!" The men shouldered their rifles, their bayonets pointed once more skyward and glinting in the sunshine. "Take aim!" White-gloved fingers found triggers. "Fire!" 16 cracks rang out in the silence again, and the tolling funeral bells of 16 gloved hands, racking back the bolts and ejecting shiny brass casings, rang once more. "Take aim!" Once again, white-gloved fingers found figures. "Fire!" The crack of guns rolled over the gathered crowd. Spent brass clinked against spent brass. "Take aim!" The men once more did as bidden. "Fire!" The buglers began to play taps again as the little Rog went to his final rest, and her husband policed the brass. She doled out the spent casings to Roger's and Robbie's closest friends, those who were still alive in any case, outside the family. However, as the buglers fell silent, and her fallen sons lay in their graves, her husband's resolve finally broke as she reached out to accept the 2nd silk bag of spent brass. He had not permitted himself to grieve, not truly. Well, there was still duty to be done. Now, though, now the enemy had been defeated, the honors had been awarded, and now this grim duty had been accomplished. He collapsed onto her shoulder and wept the tears of a father who has outlived his sons. Mary George found that she had not run out of tears just yet. Then jazz began. The band struck up with an old New Orleans favorite, or what was alleged to be one, and Mary and Eric found shaky smiles creeping onto their faces. The only thing that she could find out about Ignitia wakes is that they played jazz on the march away from the graves. Well, It fit nicely with the Irish tradition for wakes, and she had every intention of shaking the bulkheads with their joy for 2 short lives lived well and honorably, despite being ended too soon. End of chapter. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.